This is Nicholas Alexiou from the Department of Sociology and the Hellenic American Project, Queen's College CUNY. And today, which is August 17th, we are very happy, pleased and honored to have an oral history interview with a dear friend, a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan personality. It's RENEE PAPPAS, who is, among other things, a publicist, a fundraiser, a co-founder of the platform Greek to Me. And we thank you very much for agreeing to have this interview with the Hellenic American Project in the series of the oral history archives at Queen's College, CUNY.
Well, Nico, I'm very happy that you were able to come up here. We're in Hudson, New York, where I've lived for about the past year and a half. And earlier I took you on a little tour of my house and my art collection and everything. And so here we are. So my paternal grandfather, Petros Bouzeas, left the village of Vervena, which is outside of Tripoli. It's actually 1,000 meters on the mountain. When you leave Tripoli and go south to go to Sparta, you'll see a sign that says Tegeia, and you turn left, and then you just climb, and you keep going up and up and up. And you get to Vervena, and it's very interesting because once you get there, it's like a plateau then. The village is on this wonderful plateau, and there are streams that are running through it. And now it's incredibly, well, it was always probably beautiful, but certainly when he left, let's say primitive. Today, everybody has rebuilt these wonderful stone houses and so forth. But then, of course, it was a very rough existence. And actually, every year, they would take their provata and go down the mountain to Astros, and they would stay in Astros in the winter because it was way too cold to be up there. And then in the spring, they'd come up to Vervena with the provata. And so they did this twice a year. My grandfather left Vervena in 1897, and he traveled to France, and then he took a boat from Normandy, from Le Havre. I think it was I'm pretty sure it was a German boat, and got to New York. And then he went to Chicago, because at that time there were already a number of people from Vervena who had immigrated to Chicago, maybe a couple years earlier. So he went there, and his first work was he had a horse and wagon with fruits and vegetables and so forth. Then the next year, the year after, two brothers, Dimitri and George, their name in Greece was Teklas, Teklas, but they had a parachukli, a nickname, Pikra. And why were they called that? Because their mother had died when their youngest brother, Yanni, was born, and their father died 2 years later. So they were orphans. So the oldest brother was Dimitri, then there was George, then there was my grandmother, Kostandina, then there was a sister, Eleni, and then there was Yanni. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot. There was an older sister called Panayota, older than Dimitri. She married in Vervena and had a number of children and so forth. But Dimitri and George left in about, I think, 1898, 1899, and again went to France, took the boat over.
Because it wasn't direct.
There wasn't direct. I don't think there were direct boats from Piraeus until maybe 1905.
Yeah, when the massive way started.
Right, when the massive.
Probably people came because in the area of Peloponneso is what we call the phylloxera.
I know they had the
Stafida.
Yeah,
And that probably was one of the
one of the things.
one
But
of
also
the
they were,
reasons.
even
Yeah.
aside from that, they were
And,
really, really poor.
And I'm glad that you mentioned about the tour of the house, because it's really very exceptional, and I'm very glad we did that, and so people can see it and learn about art and other things. And I want to thank especially for today our film director Yanni Koutalis, who is shooting
Right.
also
So I've taken him on a journey through the house,
piece.
and
It was a really nice experience, and
good. Well, so
but this is so. So the family went to Chicago because already some members were there, and usually this is the case.
Other people from Vervana.
Yeah.
And interestingly, somebody sent me, and I have it, and I'll send it to you. Someone did a thesis on these fraternal societies, and the one that he studied was the Vervagnotti Society. So anyway, the two brothers got to Chicago, and they were doing a similar thing with the horse and cart and so forth. And the story is that there was a fire in the barn where they kept the horses, and suddenly, they sort of lost everything. And then my grandfather, who probably knew them, I mean, it was a village, of course he must have known them, then they went into business together. And so that must have been about 1900 or something. So by 1910, they actually had a couple of grocery stores, fruit and vegetables, okay, at that point. And they were then able, the two brothers, to bring Costandina, my grandmother, and their youngest brother, Yanni. They brought them first, and you've seen pictures of them. And of course, they married her to their partner, my grandfather. Now, he was probably 20 years older than her. Anyway, but
it was typical of that.
Huh?
It was typical of that.
Yeah, that was typical. So they married. My mother was their first child, and they.
So your mother was born in the States.
Yeah, she was born in Chicago, and then her siblings, her brother, the next was Tom, and then there was Mary, and then there was another little boy, Dimitri, and then there was Philippos, my Uncle Phil. And so they did, they came up in the world. And at some point in the 1920s, they bought what was called a two-family house in Austin. And it was very close to one. They had a couple of these grocery stores. So my grandmother, grandfather, my mother and her siblings lived on the first floor. And at that time, upstairs was the younger brother Yanni and his wife Penelope, the oldest brother Dimitri and his wife Yordia, and George, the bachelor brother. Okay. Now, normally what would have happened would be probably Uncle Jim and Georgia would have stayed in the upstairs and whatever, but tragically, she had like 7 miscarriages and stillborn babies, so they never had a living child. And then Aunt Penny and Uncle John had 2 sons, but then the Depression came. Yeah. And so they all lived upstairs, the 2 couples, the 2 boys, and Uncle George, and the Buzeuses lived downstairs. And then at some point, at the end of the 1920s, I'm not sure of the exact date, my mom was 13, I know, so anyway, a really horrible thing happened. Somebody had left the gate. They had a garden in the back, okay? And somebody had left the gate open, and this little boy, Dimitri, ran out, and he was hit by a car and killed. And so my grandmother was pregnant, and she died in childbirth. and the baby was, stillborn. So it's really a horrible, horrible tragedy. And so, that's what happened with
Do you
them.
know if all this time that the family members were in Chicago, if they visited Greece or
No.
they
They never
sent money back? At
Oh
all?
God, yeah, they sent tons of money. Oh, then the next. Oh, I'm sorry, I left out. They then brought their other unmarried sister, Eleni, and they brought her to Chicago after they brought my grandmother and Yanni, and she married a man called Stephen Barkoulis, and he was related to the Greek actor.
The famous Barkoulis.
Yes,
Yeah.
what was his first name? Anyway, somebody
Yes,
knows.
yes.
Anyway, yeah, they were cousins or something. Anyway, and so she married and had a number of children, and they were all, but they were all very close, all the first cousins. I mean, they spent time together. Not only did they build the Church of the Assumption in Chicago, they were some of the main fundraisers and contributors, but not only did they send money back to their sister Panayota, who had, I think by that time, 5 or 6 children in Vervena, but in Vervena, there's a huge church, big. I mean, it looks like it should be in Tripoli or something. They built that, and they had the inauguration, I think, in the 1920s. They were sending money for years.
But they never visited Greece. They never returned.
They never went back. And they also built a school there. So they were very
philanthropic.
Not only, of course, they helped their sister, but
They helped the village.
they helped the village, exactly. And so a lot of people, of course, would immigrate and so forth. So that's my mother's side of the family. So my mom, they grew up in a neighborhood that there were lots of different, there were Italians, there were Irish, Jewish families. I mean, probably, I would think that the majority of, the neighbors were, the kids were the children of immigrants. Probably everybody.
Yes, Chicago was very multicultural, diverse.
Yeah, and so my uncles got very much involved in sports, and in the archive you'll see there's all these things about them. They started the first Greek basketball tournaments, and they were in 1932 and so forth. So those are that, and they had a good life. Now my father, I mean, this is the thing about my father's family. Now my father, Panayotis Papadopoulos, came from a town between Pyrgos and ancient Olympia called Varvasana. Now, I only learned the story of how my father left Greece from a cousin much later, when I was living in Greece, sometime in the, 2000 or something. Now, you have to understand something. My father was the youngest child in the family. And when I was born, he was 50. So all my first cousins on my father's side are a generation or 2 generations older than me. So when I was living in Athens, there had been a few articles written about me in different magazines about what I was doing, which we'll talk about in terms of Greek art and publicity and everything. And I found this letter, handwritten in Greek, on my fax machine. And this lady said, "Hello, I'm Panayota, and I'm the granddaughter of your Uncle George, and I'd really love to meet you." And so, oh, great, okay. So I called her, and she invited me to her house for dinner. She lived in Piraeus, and there were other relatives, and there was my cousin, Stephanos, who was like 80-something years old. And so I met him, and he told me this story. Okay. So I gather that my father's family was rather prominent. They had a lot of olive groves. And what's interesting today is that one branch of the family actually has an incredible olive olive oil factory, and they've been winning prizes internationally for organic olive oil. So we had a lot of Horafia and a lot of olive trees. Anyway, my dad evidently fell in love with a girl from the village, but the local bandit, the local bad guy, who he told me his name was Katsiko Petros, okay, he was after her. So there was a gunfight in the platea, and their house was right on the platea, and there was a gunfight between my father and this bandit guy. Anyway, shooting, the bandit grabbed a lady, she got shot, not killed. And then maybe, I don't know if the other guy got wounded. Anyway, he took off. And so the brothers, the older brothers of my father, had a meeting. They said, look, wherever they're going to get arrested, there'll be a vendetta. We've got to get out of here. So somehow they all got passports, and you saw the one, my dad's passport, and they had relatives. They knew someone, anyway, in Massachusetts, I think in Lowell, Massachusetts, and that's where they went first.
So he went through Ellis Island.
Yeah, they all went through Ellis Island.
Do you know which year he came to New
Yeah,
York?
I've got it. It's all in the documents and everything. Yeah, 1929, I think.
1929.
But then what happened?
When the crisis began, you know.
Anyway,
crash.
so they got.
Yeah.
But then, according to cousin Stephanos, the bandit kidnapped the girl and made her marry him, and then she poisoned him.
It's like a movie.
I mean, what a story. My nice dad, okay. So anyway, all these things happened, and slowly, two of the brothers went back to Greece. Uncle Nick, who was the oldest, and then Christos and his wife, I think in the late 30s, while Uncle George stayed, and I remember him when I was a child, and Uncle Sotiris, he had a big family, and, you know, like that.
But with your father here in the New England area, and
No, then they went to Chicago.
Oh, they moved to Chicago.
Then they went to Chicago.
And this is how they met, your parents. Your father met your mother.
Okay, so they met. It was after the war. Both my uncles were.
They served the army.
Yeah, and actually, my uncle, he had finished my Uncle Tom had finished college, and he was what they called, I think they called them the 30-day wonder boys, and he became an officer in the Navy. Uncle Phil was younger, and he was in the Army, but at the very end of the war. My father, I guess, I don't know, he was too old by that time or something. Anyway, he wasn't in the Army. And a lady who was, I think, what she called a matchmaker, proxenitra. The proxenitra introduced them, and actually I've got photographs that are in the archive of their first date. And so they liked each other, and so they got married. You saw the wedding pictures. I mean,
beautiful.
A cast of thousands. So they had the big wedding. And then, you know, things were still, that was 1946, and things in Europe, and especially in Greece, were not very well.
Yeah.
So
because Greece went through
into the Civil War and all this. So they couldn't go to Greece for their honeymoon. So instead, they went to a place that at that time was a very big resort, and that was Hot Springs, Arkansas. Okay. So I was conceived in Arkansas because I was born, you know, in March. They were married in June, and they went on their honeymoon in July. So anyway, I've never been to Arkansas, at least not as a person. So anyway, so that's the story. My dad and his brothers had a couple of businesses. They had a barber shop, they had a cleaners, and they had a bar, a tavern. And so we were later told all sorts of interesting stories. I gather there was some gambling that went on in this place. And later, when my sister and I were in California and got in the music business, there's a famous club called the Whiskey A Go Go. And the people that ran it were Elmer Valentine and Mario. God, I can't remember Mario's last name, but they were both from Chicago. And the mob obviously owned the whiskey, and Elmer was a Chicago cop. And he was what was known as the bag man for the precinct. Now, who was the bag man? The bag man was a guy that went around and collected money from the different people who did business so that they wouldn't be bothered. And so we found out much later that, of course, Elmer knew our dad from his business. So it was very funny, this whole thing, the way it all came together. Okay, back to my dad had some health problems, and he died when I was about, he died in January. I would have been 9 years old in March, and my sister was 6.5. So it was difficult, because our mother wasn't exactly the most responsible person. And a lot of things happened. And ultimately, she met someone. And we left Chicago. And the family didn't know where we were for years. We just sort of disappeared.
But always in the States.
Yeah, no, we were in the United States. We were in North Carolina. We were in Dallas, and eventually we were in Southern California, and I started junior high and high school and so forth, and like that. And we lived in a little town, a suburb of LA, that was kind of like American Graffiti. You know that movie?
Yes, of course. Classic.
People in their cars
Yes,
and
yes.
drive-ins and so forth. Yeah, so that was that very typical American junior high and high school kind
But
of growing.
because of the Greek background of the family
Yeah.
that your mother had, what languages you were speaking at home, or food?
Well, when I
it-
was a little girl, my father and mother would, I mean, there was Greek spoken between my mother and father. Certainly when we went to the family things, which we, this was constant. There were weddings,
Yes,
there was
yes,
Christmas,
yes,
there was
yes.
Thanksgiving, there were name days, there
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah.
So with my mother's side of the family, the Peckrases and the Buzaises, yes, there was Greek. We heard it. And Connie and I went to Greek school for, I don't know, a year, 2 years, after school, after regular school. So we had, a little
But
bit.
you had friends who weren't Greeks.
Oh, of course.
A lot of your friends and
Of course.
you were
Of course.
Americans. Or
No, we
other
lived in
ethnicities.
a suburb called Summit. And yeah, it was a nice little suburb
you
of
see-
Chicago. I mean, we went into
Yeah.
we went to church.
Uh-huh.
Daddy would drive us, and we'd go
Yeah.
to Assumption, the
Yeah.
church that the uncles and everyone, and we went to Sunday school, and we went to Greek school and all that sort of thing. But then when my dad died, and this whole thing happened, and we left, yes, we'd go to the Greek church wherever we happened to be, but it wasn't the same kind of thing. And then we got to LA, we started going to St. Sophia. And so,
Your father's, maybe your mother's generation, we have some documentation that they suffer some kind of discrimination when people knew that they were of Greek background. Do you see any similarities or differences with your generation, since you were
Well,
already
we always
you're already Americans?
yeah, but we always knew. I mean, we always knew we were Greek. We all, you know, whether it was the my mother was quite a good cook and a baker and all that sort of thing, but no, we didn't have the kind of Greek American experience that we would have had in Chicago, because there were this huge family
Yeah,
thing around. We
yeah.
didn't have that. We were out of that. But then at a certain point, they found us, and then communications came together with them,
Okay.
and some of them came, you know, and visited and so forth. And then it became, and we went to Chicago and visited them as well.
But you heard stories from the family side that they had discrimination as Greeks in Chicago at some point?
The what?
If they had any discrimination incidents?
Well, interestingly, in the book that my mom's cousin wrote, which I want him to send you a PDF, but I'll show you the
that'd be
book
great.
today. He talks about something that I found really incredible because it happened to him. And this was in either probably the early 60s. He had graduated with a degree in education, and he was a teacher. And so he had applied for a job at, I don't know, some sort of, a suburb, okay? And the guy told him that he wasn't, this is like the 60s, okay, this isn't like 1930. And he told Tom that he wasn't going to hire him because he was a Greek. 1960s?
Yeah.
Wow, that's something else. Now, what happened to them in the early days, I don't know, but I venture to guess that there were a lot of situations that happened to them. I can't believe that there wouldn't have been, of discrimination. But that's also something that, frankly, today's Greek Americans, they've got a little, they black that out of their memory. But that's why the AHEPA was formed. The AHEPA was formed because Greeks were being discriminated against, very much so in the South. I mean, the
Yeah.
AHEPA was founded in Atlanta.
In Atlanta, Georgia, of course.
Greeks were lynched.
In 1922, yes. 20, yeah.
Greeks were lynched.
Yeah. The
Greek
the
town
Ku Klux Klan,
Greek town, I think it was in Oklahoma, was burned down. So
No, in Omaha.
Greek Americans today they don't kind of want to deal with that. They weren't considered quite white.
But of course, later they were accepted. Your generation later were able to be part of the American mosaic. Well,
Yeah, but people, I mean, don't forget that I don't remember the exact name of the legislation, but in the late 1920s, legislation was passed limiting the number of immigrants that could come.
Oh yeah, the
from
quota system. Yeah.
the
Yeah, the
from
quota
Southern
system.
Europe.
Yes, in 1924.
From
yes.
Eastern Europe, what was it? Yeah,
Yes, yeah.
okay. And there was a quota system. Again,
Yes.
this was a backlash
Yes,
against
yes.
Greeks, Jews, Eastern Europeans in general, Southern Italians.
Yes.
I mean, forget about the Chinese. That
It
was
was
another
banned completely, yeah,
Chinese
yeah,
Exclusion
yeah,
Act and so
exclusion,
forth.
Exclusion Act.
You know, and people, you know, that's part of
So-
history
So
that.
tell us about your studies.
Okay. Well, okay. High school. Then I went to 2 years of college. We had moved down to the beach, to Newport, Huntington Beach. So I went to 2 years at Orange Coast College. It was a junior college. I took history, and so on and so forth. And then my sister and I, by accident, got in the music business because we were working for a doctor after school, and he was a big fan of folk music. And there was a club in Huntington Beach called the Golden Bear, and the man who owned it was a complete disaster in terms of business, and he owed the IRS and God knows who he didn't owe. And so Bob, the doctor, bailed him out, paid for everything, and for a couple of months let him continue to run it, which was a big mistake. And there were two Greek brothers, George and Ted Nikas, which I'm hoping we're going to have a wonderful interview that was done for a documentary on George. Anyway, they owned coffee houses. In other words, these were little clubs, no liquor license, and one was in Seal Beach and the other was in Newport Beach. So Bob, Dr. Bob, brought them in and asked them to come in as partners, and of course they would run the club, and he would be the silent partner. So the Golden Bear has a really interesting history because in the 1920s it was built by a Greek man, and it was a restaurant and a bar, and a very cool restaurant and bar, because all these people from Errol Flynn, Gary Cooper, whatever, they would come to Huntington Beach and go to the Golden Bear. And then it went through whatever changes. Okay, so it was a folk club, but it had a liquor license, it had a stage, it had professional lights and a sound system. And so suddenly they had this club that they were running.
Upscale, yeah.
Upscale, okay. So when Dr. Bob took us to meet George and Ted, when they found out we were Greek, they said, "Oh, why don't you come and work for us after school?" I said, "Oh, how can we work?" So somehow, I can't remember how we worked it out. I think we worked, one of us worked for the doctor and the other one worked at the, and we switched off. So what we would do is we would answer the phone and take reservations, because they had tables and they had like a, you had like this sort of map thing, and you would put in the name of the person and how many people and so forth, and then when they came in they were seated at their table because they made a reservation. And so George, who they'd had the coffee houses, and they would have, you know, a musician come in with an acoustic guitar or something. So suddenly they're getting calls from agents in Hollywood who represented different bands. And so one day he came in to the office and said to me, "Have you ever heard of the Butterfield Blues Band?" I said, "Yes, yeah, of course, of course." "Well, should I book them?" Yes, book them. So he booked the Butterfield Blues Band. Meanwhile, I have to go back. My sister and I had all these great friends who were surfers in Huntington Beach, and they had unbelievable taste in music. They listened to jazz. They listened to Cal Tjader. They listened
Blues.
to Wes Montgomery. They listened to James Brown. They listened to, John Lee Hooker. I mean, they listened to, and the Butterfield Blues Band, which was very innovative because half of the band was white and the other half were black. So this was really innovative. Okay.
And the Beach Boys were in their making.
Yeah, well, the Beach Boys, these surfers didn't listen to the Beach Boys. They listened to all these. So we knew about blues because of them, because they would play these records at the parties. So book the Butterfield Blues Band. So he did. And they played for 2 weeks, and there were lines around. Okay, this is a huge thing. And so what happened was the agents would call and say, "Oh, I've got this band at the Troubadour, or I've got this band at the Whiskey, or I've got this band and whatever, and we want to book them at the Golden Bear." So he would send us, Connie and me, to go look at the band. And if we liked them, then we'd come back and say, "Yeah, but oh no, don't book, they're horrible," whatever. So that's how we started getting in the music business. So we started meeting the agents, the managers, the bands. And so we became known as, the girls from the Golden Bear. And so at that time, we had this really great little 1957 Porsche. And so we would drive up to the Whiskey, and, the valet would take our car, and Mario would usher us into a great table and so forth. And so we got to know all these people. So the thing that was very exciting is we were told about the Monterey Pop Festival, which was in
Yes.
June
Oh, yeah.
of
Huge.
1967. Okay. So we jump in our little Porsche and we drive up the coast to Monterey. And a really amazing thing happened. I guess it was right past Santa Barbara. A 911 came and sort of got in front of us. And by the time we got to Monterey, there were like 10 Porsches, one after the other, all going up to the Monterey Pop Festival because we knew where we were going. When we got there, we found the drummer from the Butterfield Blues Band, Billy Davenport, and he gave us backstage passes. Now, we had some tickets for some of the shows, but we had the backstage pass, so we were going backstage, we were hanging out, and so on and so forth. So it was an amazing 3 days. I mean, the most incredible music.
Yeah. Bob Dylan.
No, Bob wasn't there.
He wasn't there.
No.
At some point, he
No,
was there.
he wasn't at
He
Monterey.
never went in Monterey.
No.
Johnny Cash.
No,
Who was there?
I'll tell you.
Yeah.
On Friday night, it was Simon and Garfunkel. It was Laura Nero. It was, I think, the Association. On Saturday, it was Janis Joplin with Big Brother and the Holding Company, the Grateful Dead, the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, the Electric Flag. Who else? Moby Grape. Then that night, Otis Redding.
Oh, I see. Incredible.
And the next day, okay, Ravi Shankar, which, okay, was a little, anyway, it was interesting.
It was kosher all the time, or sometimes it wasn't very kosher?
Was it what?
It was kosher. The culture of festivals and music festivals.
It was the first rock festival ever. I mean, there had been a Monterey Jazz Festival for years in the same place. In fact, the person who came up with the idea of the Monterey Pop Festival was a man called Alan Pariser. And he was actually a great friend of, we all became really good friends, but he was a guy who also managed later the Average White Band and Delaney and Bonnie. But it was his idea, and he was friends with Lou Adler, who was a producer. He was the producer of the Mamas and Papas, among many other groups, and John Phillips. And so they took the idea and ran with it, and that's how it all developed. No, that was, to me, that was the festival. Oh, The Who. What am I talking about? For God's sake. The Who and Hendrix and Jimi Hendrix. I mean, in 3 days in one place. I mean, I know a lot of people talk about Woodstock, but Monterey wasn't, I mean, it was small enough that, yes, there were a lot, but it wasn't this vast thing. Anyway, so Connie and I, we got back. We'd been to all the concerts. We were backstage and whatever. And so we said, George, okay, this is who you've got to book this summer. So we had at the Golden Bear, Janis Joplin, the Electric Flag, obviously Butterfield again, Buffalo Springfield, the Byrds. It was an unbelievable summer. So at some point, I guess I had graduated, whatever, from my 2 years at Orange Coast, and Connie had finished 1 year, and we decided we really wanted to be in the music business, and we wanted to move to LA, and we did. And we moved to Laurel Canyon. Where else would we move? So Frank Zappa lived down the street, and you know, all these other people lived in the neighborhood. And so we both got jobs in the music business. I first got a job at the William Morris Agency. And then I later got a job with a man called Dan Weiner, who had come from New York to run the music department at an agency called Ashley Famous. Okay, so I went to work for Danny, and my sister got a job at Sunset Sound Recording Studios. So that's how this whole thing happened, and
This is around which year?
that would have been 69, something like that.
Which was a decade of a lot of movements, the anti-war movement, the anti
Yeah, okay, that was happening, but we were very much, we were in Hollywood, and we were involved in.
But because the music of many of those people, it was a reaction.
Some of the artists,
to the
like
political
the
political situation.
No, there was
a social situation.
Yeah, there was definitely some of that. I mean, the Buffalo Springfield and so forth. So anyway, so I was at the agency. I was a secretary, and then they asked me if I wanted to be an agent. Well, sure, but I didn't become a rock agent. I became a lecture agent. The company had been purchased, the agency, by a man called Marvin Josephson, and he had one of the foremost lecture agencies in the country. And he had people like all the big broadcaster anchors in those days, Eric Severide, and I think they had Cronkite and lots of authors and everything. So anyway, I was the West Coast lecture agent. So at that time, I signed for lectures. I signed Tom Brokaw, and I also represented Dennis Hopper when he had finished the movie that he did in Peru, the very weird movie. And anyway, so I represented him.
But he was very political also. And
he was. But anyway, so then what happened was that we knew the Beach Boys. And so one night we were out at dinner, Connie and I, and Bruce Johnston and Mike Love. And they said, "Oh, you've got to come work for us," they said to me. We're starting a new company. We signed a new record deal with Warner Brothers, and we have our own label and all this stuff. And, "Oh, you've got to come, and you can run our office, our personal appearance department." My title was the Director of Personal Appearances. Okay. So I resigned from the agency, and I went to the Beach Boys. And if you've seen any of the movies about the Beach Boys, they were far more dysfunctional than the movies ever showed. And you had all these horrible things going on with poor Brian and everything, and it was just a real mess. Now, but what did happen was, because of the Beach Boys, that's how I met my first husband, Jerry Wexler, because they were playing at the closing of the Fillmore East, and as were the Allman Brothers, and so he'd done a live recording of it. And he wanted to put out this live album. And so I was asked to have a meeting with him to see if the Beach Boys would agree, to be on that album. And so that's how we met. And then there's a book called Heroes and Villains about the Beach Boys. And it goes into a great deal about the mess that was going on there, so I'm not going to go into the details of it.
I know some of the stories.
Yes,
and their song, Would You Be Nice, it's one of my favorite songs.
Yeah, listen, Brian is a very talented person. Very talented. But the problem was the dysfunctional situation that was going on there. Anyway, I left the Beach Boys, and
after how long? A year?
Oh, more than a year. I must have been there at least a year and a half. And then someone that I knew from the agency, who had been an agent there, was starting a record company and had a management company, and that was David Geffen. So he asked me to come and work for him, and in the management company. So that management company we had Jackson Browne and the Eagles and Linda Ronstadt and Crosby, Stills and Nash.
Oh my God.
And a number of other artists. And also they had the record company, Asylum Records. So not all of the artists were on Asylum. I mean, Crosby, Stills and Nash were on Atlantic.
Yeah.
Joni Mitchell was on Warner Brothers. But anyway, so I got there. And so I was at the beginning of when they were all starting their careers and everything.
Yeah, Johnny Mitchell, still, see.
Yeah, so that was very cool. Yeah, it was a really nice, it was a fun office because they'd come and hang out, the musicians. So they'd spend time. So the music was great and the people were great. In the meantime, my sister got a job working for Howard Rose, who was at IFA, that agency that I had been in. And his client was, one of his clients was Elton John, new artist from England. I mean, this is at the very, very beginning. Connie worked for Howard. And then at some point, John Reed, who was Elton's manager then and significant other at that time, wanted to open a management office in LA. And whoever the guy was that he wanted to run it didn't want to leave England. And so he hired my sister to run the office. And she worked for Elton for 40 years, both with John Reed and then later with her own company. So that whole thing went on. In any case, I had met Jerry, and then he asked me to marry him, and I moved to New York and resigned from Geffen Roberts Management. And when I got to New York, then the first thing I really did, well, I sort of got myself settled in my new life, and I took a cordon bleu cooking class, and then also went to France and took cooking lessons with Simone Beck, who was the partner in Mastering the Art of French Cooking with Julia Child. And I went to France and took cooking lessons with her. Anyway, then I went back to college. And I started off at Finch, which was a women's college in New York. And then because of all sorts of strange things that happened, including a giant flood on Park Avenue and all the facilities being flooded, Finch ultimately closed. And I got my degree from Marymount in New York. And so
that was in art history.
History and art history, yeah. So I was very much involved, and Jerry had a very extensive collection of art, and so I also got involved with the American Federation of Arts. I got on one of their boards, and very much involved in terms of artists and so forth. I got my degree, and then after we bought the house in East Hampton, that's when I met my friend Priscilla, who had a decorating firm, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, I always enjoyed decorating. I always, even the apartment that my sister and I had on our own in West Hollywood, I mean, I have photos of that. So I was always interested in antiques and decorating and so forth. And so I joined their company, and I did a lot of I had some interesting clients, including Rupert and Anna Murdoch. I did their apartment in New York, and I did an apartment for Linda Ronstadt and a number of other people, a lot of people in the music business. So
and also actors and directors.
Well, I did Michael Phillips' apartment, who was a producer, produced Taxi Driver and Close Encounters. So I was very busy with all that, and quite happy with that. In the meantime, my sister.
You like New York?
Yeah, I loved New York at that time. It was fantastic.
Because it's a different pace than LA or
Yeah,
Chicago.
but I was living New York in the 70s. I mean, Jerry and I married in January of 1973. For me, it was great. I mean, I had wonderful.
New York also, like Chicago earlier, New York in the 70s, it was one settlement with a lot of Greeks from Greece, because it was the junta in Greece and a lot
Yeah,
of young people came.
that
You had any connection, any association with the
not
Greek community in New
no,
York?
not really, not really, not for a long. No, not
You
till.
never decorated any Greek American.
No, no, no. I
Okay.
wasn't involved in anything really. I mean, once in a while, I mean, okay, I'd go to church, to the cathedral at Easter or something. But no,
Yeah, because you lived close by. You lived.
I lived on after Central Park South, and we
Yeah.
lived on 75th and Park. Yeah. No, I never was really involved. I think what happened was, though, that when Jerry and I took a trip to Greece in the early 80s, and we went to my dad's village in Vadvasana, and I saw the house and I met all those relatives. I had a real, I don't know, sort of epiphany. Now, the Greek, I was friendly with a couple of people who were Greek, Ilya Kazan, for example.
Yeah.
We were introduced to Ilya by our friend Jerry Lieber. Jerry Lieber was part of the songwriting team of Lieber and Stoller. Anyway, so he introduced us, and we all became very, very good friends. Ilya would, he'd come to dinner pretty often, and I actually introduced him to his third wife, my friend Frances, who had just gotten divorced, and his second wife, Barbara Loden, had died. So anyway, I put them together. So
He ever talk about politics?
no, not really, not really. No, didn't really
Because it
talk.
was a dark cloud over him for
No,
some
I
time.
know all about that. I know about the McCarthy things and so on and
Yes.
so forth. No, I mean,
Great movies, yeah.
great
I'm a great
movies.
fan of
And
him.
he was very interesting because whenever he would come to dinner, first of all, he never talked about himself. Never talked, how some people talk,
Oh,
I
yes,
did
yes,
this, or
yes,
no, no, no. Whoever he was placed next to at dinner, he would talk to them and he would ask about them. I mean, in fact, what happened was one year, I would bring my mom to New York every year for Christmas, okay, and she'd stay for a couple of weeks. So we had a dinner party, and Ilya came to the party, and he and my mother were talking. And I think this is at the time that he was starting to write the sequel to America, America. And he said to my mother, he said, he said, I never had any sisters, and I'd really like to, could I talk to you about what it was like being a young girl growing up in that? So, sure. So one afternoon, so they worked it out, and one afternoon he came over and he spent the couple of hours with her and talked to her about what her growing up was all about. But no, I wasn't involved in anything particularly Greek, except when I went to the village and everything. I don't know, something happened, and I just had this sort of.
And we need to note that this is your first time ever to Greece.
No, this was the second
The
time.
second time.
The first time, my mom had gone to the HEPA convention,
Okay.
which was, I guess, like 1970 or something like that. And she stayed a year and a half. And I must say, she went all over Greece. And so we had family there. So she stayed with different cousins and so forth. And then I was working for the Beach Boys. And so I had my vacation and I went to Greece. So on that trip, we stayed with the family in Athens and then in Philothea. Yeah, they had a wonderful house in Philothea. And then we went to Hydra and so forth, and that was great. And And
either in the 70s was
yeah, that
all
was
the
very
jet
cool.
set
And there was what was it called, La
activity.
Caldera, that club.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
yeah, it was very nice. I mean, it was lovely. But then I went with Jerry in about 1980, I guess, with a couple of friends. And there was something that happened to me. I don't know. I went to that village and I saw these people that looked like I mean, people that I didn't know, but they were my family, and it was a very emotional
But
kind of.
they knew that they had family in America,
Oh,
right?
of course they
They
did.
knew.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Oh no, of course they did.
yeah.
But I,
How they received you with
they were very sweet. They were very nice. Of course, my Greek was non-existent at that point. But no, they were very sweet and very nice. And I just had this, I suppose, with my father dying and losing sort of this connection, and suddenly,
yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, all this started happening. And I guess I started being interested in things Greek. And I had met through a friend, I had met Yannis Simonidis.
Yeah, I
Do you
know
know
him.
him? Yeah,
The
okay.
actor and
Yeah,
director.
actor and director and so on and so forth.
We have interviewed him. Sorry to interrupt you. We have interviewed him for the archives.
Oh,
He's in the archives. Yeah,
well,
of the Hellenic American
I
Project.
have
We
a
him.
video of, well, this is later, of him. Anyway, I can talk about that
The
later.
Socrates when he played the
No. When he had a show, the Archdiocese had like a TV show where he would have people on and have panels and interview
Yeah, I
people.
remember.
So I was on it with John Bradamus.
Oh
Remember?
my
Yeah.
goodness!
Yeah, that was
One
very
of the
cool.
most important
Yeah.
politicians.
Yeah, he was great. Well, I had met him previously because these other friends of ours, of Jerry's and mine, were friends with him, in another situation.
And since this year is the 50th grim anniversary of the Cyprus invasion, Bradimas was in the committee along with other Greek Americans, Sarbanis, for example.
Yeah.
And,
Well, he was the House Majority Whip,
yes,
and then
and
he
replaced
became the
significant-
president of NYU.
Yeah.
So I was on this show with him. Anyway, it was very nice. But so I guess, I mean, I was always interested in, ancient Greece and art and so on and so forth. But this kind of family thing that happened when I went to the village, and I started getting interesting in more sort of Greek things. And then I guess the next year, Jerry and I decided to rent a house in Greece that summer for a month. And we did. We rented a house from some people that we'd met on that initial trip. And we rented a house in Vavrona near the temple of Artemis and so
beautiful,
forth.
beautiful,
Yeah,
temple.
it was really gorgeous.
Yeah.
And but then Jerry didn't come for a couple of weeks. I went, and because something was happening, he was recording an album and they didn't finish it. And so I had met some friends. I had some friends in Athens, and I met other people. And the head of Warner's in Greece at that time, I remember he had taken me to a party, and Irene Pappas was there, so I met her, and I met Michael Kakoyannis, and I met a lot of people involved in the arts in Greece, and
Which was your domain.
yeah, so I met a lot of people, and then of course at that time I did meet my second husband, Spiros Fokas, the actor. And we met through another mutual friend and so forth. And then Jerry and I went back to New York, of course, and continued my life and whatever. But when I met Spiro, he also introduced Jerry and I to Kostas Feris, who was preparing this movie Rembetiko.
Rembetiko, yeah.
And he gave Jerry this giant book of Rembetiko. And he came to New York, Kostas, and with the idea of, trying to get financing and so forth. And I got involved at some point with that. Anyway, and then Jerry and I got divorced. And then I decided to move to Greece. And so when I moved to Greece,
That was a big decision.
yeah, and what happened was, what was really interesting, it was a coincidence. A very interesting woman and a friend of mine called Barbara Rose, who was considered the preeminent expert on 20th century American art. She was both, a curator and a professor. She happened to be in Athens organizing, she was curating a show of major American painters at the Pinakotheki. And so she had just divorced her husband, Jerry Lieber, the guy who was part of Lieber and Stoller, the music team. So anyway, Barbara then took me to a dinner at Dolly Goulandris's house. So I met Dolly, and I met Ian Vores, and I met Alexander Yolas. So I got to Greece and I met all these people. And it was very interesting at that time because, of course, Ian had started his museum with Yolas. I mean, this is like a very funny story. So he invited me to come.
Huge and controversial personality and character. Huge and controversial also personality and character.
Yeah, well, hey, if you're not controversial, then you're boring, right? But anyway, Yolas invited me to come and see the house, which was phenomenal. I mean, so when I got there, they had me come in through the back door, okay, and there was this big kitchen, and there was a chaise longue in the center of the kitchen, and he was like stretched out on the chaise longue. And I thought, oh my God. And he said, oh, darling. He said, so-and-so will take you through the house. Okay, fine. So we go through the house, and we're looking at all these wonderful paintings and furniture and everything and whatever, and we come back. And then he said, have you shown her the boutique? I thought, boutique? What does he have, a shop here? What is he doing? So, oh, yes, come, you've got to see the boutique. So he takes me downstairs, and I wouldn't say it was the basement, but it was the lower level, and it was his closet. And he had, I have to tell you, he had one whole wall of fur coats in every color you could, pink and green and everything else. And then he had caftans, and then of course he had suits. And he was just this amazing character. And then, this is really funny. And then suddenly I got back into the kitchen where he was stretched out on the chaise longue, and a man knocked on the door, and someone came in, and there's a little old man with no teeth. Okay, had no teeth. And he came in, and he said, oh, listen, he's going to read our coffee cups. So they gave us coffee and this little old man. Anyway, so I know Yolas, and he would invite us to different parties. And also what happened is the American Federation of Arts that I was on the board had a trip to Greece. So they got in touch with me. And so I arranged for them to go to Yolas's house, and he gave a cocktail party, and then Ian Vores had them for lunch and took them around his. So, I got to know these people once I got there, and met different artists. I met the Lalaunis's then as well, and during the time.
Are your earrings Lalaunis?
Who?
Your earrings are Lalaunis?
Yeah, these are Lalaunis. They do make things in silver as well as gold. So I knew them I've known them for a really long time. So I was very much involved at that time in sort of looking after Spiros in his career. And
He got a great role in a very, nice movie.
Well, he
With
had a
Michael.
long career in Italy.
Yeah,
He'd done
he
some
already
really
had, yeah.
great movies and worked with some big directors and
Yeah,
everything. But
yeah.
at that time, he was
Yeah.
back in Greece. Anyway, we got married in California, and Michael Phillips and his wife came to our wedding, and Michael Phillips was very good friends with Michael Douglas. And when I saw that Michael Douglas was making a sequel to Romancing the Stone, and it would take place in North Africa, and the villain was going to be like a Gaddafi kind of guy, I said to Michael Phillips, well, what do you think? What about three? He said, yeah, let's call Michael. So we did, and Michael Douglas at that point was in New York, and he was both directing and starring in A Chorus Line. But he was also producing
Yeah.
Jewel of the Nile. I mean, it was in
Yeah,
pre-production. So Spiro and I went to New York, and I met Michael at the theater where they were filming, and we had shots of Spiro. And also on the way to California, we'd stopped in London, and he then I put him together with an agent called James Sharkey, a very
Famous, yeah.
well-respected
Well-known,
English agent, and so he took on Spiro as a client. And Michael said, oh, yeah, he looks good. And
Of course.
yeah, so we went back to Greece, and like a day after we were in Greece, the phone rang. Would Spiro come to Morocco to meet with the director and Michael? And he did, and he got the part.
Yeah.
And so
That's a great story.
there we go. And then after he did that, we decided to move to LA. His agent then was Paul Kohner in LA, who worked with James Sharkey. And Spiro did a couple of things there in LA. He did a Rambo movie, and he did a couple of TV things and everything. Anyway, and then we split up, and I decided to move back to Greece again, actually, because I had been introduced to two brothers, David and Zev Braun, who wanted to do a mini-series for the Turner Network on Alexander the Great. And so they asked me if I would come on board and help them get assistance from the Greek government and so on and so forth. Anyway, so I moved back to Greece, and I bought my apartment.
This is now in the 90s.
Yeah, this is early 90s.
Early 90s.
90s. Okay, so I
It
moved back
was
to Greece.
golden years for Greece.
So I bought the apartment on Adrianou, facing the temple of Hephaestus. Yeah, and I was able to get them some incredible financing, because I think what offset deals are. Okay, so of course Greece had purchased F-16s,
Yes.
and there was the offset that a certain amount of the money had to be invested back. And so I took the producers to that entity, and they loved it, and they committed a big amount of money to it. And over the couple of years, unfortunately, they couldn't come up with a script that everybody was happy with, and so it never happened. And so I kind of found myself, I mean, on that project, I was, going to be associate producer and so forth, and I had brought in the big investment, and also the Greek Ministry of Defense was behind it. Spilios Spiliotopoulos was the deputy minister then. I mean, it was all a real win-win situation. Anyway, it didn't happen. But what did happen is that I started getting contacted by people through the American Embassy who were coming to film in Greece. And they were having problems, a lot of people,
a lot of them.
in getting the permits and so forth. So one of the projects was a project called Lost Civilizations, and that was for NBC and Time Life. And that was a series, 1 hour shows. They were broadcast on NBC ultimately, and then Time Life had the video cassettes and so forth. So they had obviously China, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and so forth. Greece was the only country that they had 2 episodes. They had Minoan, and then they had classical. So what was happening with them, with the classical, is that they had sent to the Ministry of Culture whatever locations they wanted to shoot. And then they were told, okay, the permit is this amount, this amount, this amount. And when they got to Greece to shoot, everything had changed. The amounts of money, I mean, it was just a real mess. And so I was contacted, and can you help? Can you do something? Well, what we did, okay, because my apartment on Andrianou, the roof overlooked the Archea Gora. We did a lot of shooting from the roof and shot the Acropolis and all sorts of things. And my upstairs neighbor at that time was an actress called Eula Gavala. And instead of, paying 10 times the money to go shoot it, I guess, at the Herodoticus or something, there was the theater in a quarry. Do you remember this theater in Athens?
Yeah.
Okay. So Eula got some costumes and got a couple of her friends, and she and, oh God, and she did a scene from Medea, and that's in it. And Nikos Verlekis played Jason. And so we did a lot of stuff without having to, and it was an incredible series.